Well, thank you for joining us once again. Welcome to Grace. As we continue our journey through the Bible today, we've been looking at the reign of King David as Israel was enjoying what we called an interlude of blessing that God had instituted right after that first bucket of wrath had fallen upon the nation. Israel hadn't merited the taste of the kingdom to come, but God graciously gave it to them nonetheless to show them the stark difference in having him deal with them graciously, which he was doing during this interlude of blessing, and having him deal with them according to what their behavior merited under the law contract. During what has been called Israel's golden age, God was giving the nation every opportunity to confess their failure to live up to the dictates of the law. And they had sworn they could live up to the dictates of that law contract, not only faithfully, but consistently. And of course, we know James said if you failed in one, you failed in all. So God didn't give them the law to make them good. He gave them the law to show them they could never measure up. The flesh is worthless when it comes to meriting God's righteousness through performance. So we've already seen the patriarchs' failure. We've seen Adam's failure. We went down through the patriarchs. We looked at David's flesh and the failure of David's flesh. We looked at that over and over again. Even after God blessed David, beyond what we would think, beyond measure, by telling David that he would establish an everlasting kingdom for a son that would come from David's loins, David proved the incapacity of his flesh all over again when it came to the woman named Bathsheba. Just as a quick reminder, you'll recall that the issue from the very outset of our journey through the Bible, the very issue from the outset of the Bible narrative has been one of establishing the fact of the great capacity that's resident in God's name, as opposed to the incapacity of the flesh of humanity. Now, through each of the books we've examined thus far, we've seen the same cycle repeat itself over and over again. First, God demonstrated the capacity that he had in his name. We'll just show you this slide. He demonstrated the capacity that was resident in himself, in his name, and then he shows us the incapacity of the flesh of man. So it just repeats itself through each of the books we've examined thus far. We've seen the same cycle as it continues. God demonstrated his capacity, what he could become for man, by exercising all that was resident in his name on man's behalf graciously. And then he would show us that man would fail over and over. Man would then get to that point where he would call upon God. God would exercise the capacity resident in his name all over again, and man would feel great, and everything would be roses, so to speak, for a time, and then man would fail all over again. And so he's showing us that cycle. Not only did God exercise the various facets of his compound Jehovah name on behalf of the men of time past, he also allowed the people of time past the opportunity to prove the incapacity of their flesh. He just let it go on. God demonstrated his name, followed by a demonstration of man's failure. That's the cycle we can expect. And that's been the biblical cycle since the beginning. If Israel was to ever become what God promised them that they will indeed become in time future, a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, a peculiar treasure above all nations, then the people of his nation would need to learn the lesson that they would have to call upon God, depend solely upon God, to be some things for them and to do some things for them. Things that they could never do or be for themselves. And they'd have to depend upon the Most High God to do and be those things on their behalf graciously. As having him deal with them meritoriously would never work. This is why God put the people of Israel under that law contract in the first place. He wanted them to realize their incapacity and thus their need of him, and then call upon him. So keep in mind that God's plan, and it's never ceased being God's plan, is to repossess the earthly realm back under his headship, and to have all things on the earth be subject to him willingly. God created the heavens and the earth, therefore he has the right to be recognized as the head of all things in both realms of his creation, heaven and earth. So his plan for the repossession of the earthly realm involves the nation that he promised to make of Abram, namely a believing nation Israel of time future, which the Bible tells us will indeed come about. So through everything we've seen about David, during the time when God was working through the king that he chose to be over his nation, David's flesh was a persistent problem. That's not the case today, is it? We've just conquered that flesh. No, David found his flesh to be a persistent problem. The failure of David's flesh was no more evident than when David lusted after Bathsheba, coveting his neighbor's wife as strictly forbidden by the law contract in commandment number 10, and then committing adultery with Bathsheba in a direct violation of commandment number 7. So David followed those transgressions of the law of Moses as he ordered the death of Uriah. Now he's guilty of 3 transgressions of the law contract. Bathsheba's husband, David had slain Uriah in battle, making David guilty of violating the 6th commandment of the law, thou shalt not kill. Yet God remained with David throughout all of those events. Because God had chosen to use David, as we've said many times here, not based upon David's behavior, but based solely upon what God foreknew about David's belief. As we came to the conclusion of our previous session, we were talking about the results of David's faulty decisions. In other words, would David's sins find him out, as some people like to put it? Would it come back on David what he had done in his sinful situations? Well, certainly it would. Along with every earthly choice comes the earthly consequence, or consequences that follow that choice. And the same would be true of David, Israel's earthly king. This is a principle we've often called the law of the harvest, although that's in direct context reaping and sowing of giving to support an assembly. But it's a principle that's transdispensational. What we sow, we're going to reap. And that's very true in the behavioral aspect, not from God himself, but from the flesh. We can always expect a natural, let's call it a natural. We can always expect a natural harvest to come from the earthly choices we sow. God does not have anything to do with that, but he allows the natural consequences of our earthly choices to play themselves out. And as we've said so many times, God does not remove the earthly consequences of our faulty earthly decisions. He allows them to play out. However, when God was working with the nation Israel, according to the law contract, the Israelites could expect to not only reap the natural consequences of their faulty decisions, but to also reap some supernatural, we might call them, consequences to their sinful decisions as a result of God personally responding to those sinful situations. So when it comes to David's sins in connection with Bathsheba, David could expect to see not only the natural consequences of his faulty indiscretion there, but also a response from the Most High God due to what we read as we come to the end of chapter 11, verse 27. Let's take a look. 2 Samuel, chapter 11, verse 27. And when the morning was past, David sent and fetched her. Her who? Well, Bathsheba. He sent and fetched Bathsheba to his house, and she became his wife, and bare him a son. But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord. Now, this is the first time we've seen this with the man named David, man after God's own heart. He had now displeased the Lord. So let's first talk about the natural consequences of David's sinful actions. Fortunately, we're not told that Bathsheba and Uriah had children. So I think we can safely assume they were childless. For a daddy to die in battle would have been devastating for the children of that father. The loss of a daddy is devastating in our day from whatever cause. I'm sure it was no less devastating in King David's day. Remember, Uriah was a man of integrity, according to the biblical account, so he might very well have been a good daddy had he had children. Fortunately, no children involved, as we see nothing of the sort in the scriptural account. But how about Uriah's wife Bathsheba? Let's think about her for a moment. Was there a natural earthly consequence to David's sinful decision to have her husband Uriah slain? Was there a sowing and reaping principle in place, and that she would reap the natural consequence of that affair with Uriah? Of course there was. Bathsheba mourned according to the account. We see that in chapter 11, verse 26. And when the wife of Uriah heard that Uriah, her husband, was dead, she mourned for her husband. She was grieving that he was gone. Obviously, Bathsheba loved Uriah. Elsewise, she wouldn't have grieved. She would have rejoiced when he was gone. But she's mourning his death here. It wasn't that Bathsheba had planned a liaison with David and carried it out in a betrayal of her husband. Verse 4 of chapter 11 tells us the precise opposite was true. And David sent messengers, plural, says more than one. David just didn't send someone out to tell Bathsheba, somebody's got a crush on you, what do you think? He sent more than one. So he obviously thought she might fight this off. She might not want this advance. So he sent messengers, and notice it, took her. Didn't ask her, go back with me, and the king's got some surprises for you. He took her, and she came in unto him. Because those men, however many there may have been, and they were overpowering, I'm sure, and he lay with her. For she was purified from her uncleanness, and she returned unto her house. Notice the verse does not say she lay with him. Isn't that interesting? Sometimes you can glean some things from these passages if you look at them very carefully. It doesn't say she lay with him. He lay with her. Now, that may seem like an insignificant subtlety, but we need to understand that David, being Israel's king, no less, and Bathsheba having to be forced to go to his house in the first place, it took multiple messengers, she wasn't given a whole lot of options in this situation. In that sense, folks, Bathsheba was, in a very true sense, raped. She might have tried to fight David off, but how successful do you think she would have been once the king had made up his mind? David obviously had no qualms about having Uriah killed. Doesn't appear to me that saying stop, Bathsheba saying stop, would have done Bathsheba any good whatsoever. This shows us the digression of the flesh when it comes to satisfying its own lusts. The last thing on King David's mind at that time was whether or not the Lord would be displeased with what he was about to do. He didn't care. He wasn't thinking in that direction. What was the natural earthly consequence of David's sinful decision? Well, Bathsheba was now pregnant. Is that not a consequence? She was now pregnant with another man's baby. Put yourself in her mind for a few moments. She's home. She loves her husband. He loves her. And she's been brought to the king's house, and now she's carrying someone else's baby, a situation she'd have to explain to her husband when he came home. Do you not suppose that Bathsheba suffered a bit of stress and mental anguish about what had taken place? I bet her mind was in turmoil. I'm sure she did. Stress and anguish are natural consequences of unwise earthly decisions. And this time, that stress and anguish had been brought upon another by a decision made by David, a decision Bathsheba could do nothing about. It works no differently, folks, in our day. Our faulty decisions, the sinful decisions we make, have an effect on those around us, whether we realize those decisions affect other people or whether we don't. So Bathsheba not only had to worry about the infidelity brought about by King David, she also had the stress of anguish of becoming pregnant with David's baby. That stress and anguish was not unwarranted as she found herself carrying that baby. And if you think back and put yourself in her mental state, I'm sure she was suffering greatly. She had a lot on her plate, we would say. Must have made life very difficult for Bathsheba at that point in time. The earthly consequences that came as a natural result of faulty earthly choices can be devastating. I'm sure they were devastating to Bathsheba. And they can be devastating in our day as well. On top of all that stress and anguish that Bathsheba was obviously suffering, David had the man that Bathsheba loved killed, which caused her to mourn for the husband that she lost. We just read that. There's no mention whatsoever in the biblical account that she had the slightest inclination that David had brought her husband's death about. We're not told that she understood that David was the reason her husband died in battle. But he was the reason. As Bathsheba likely reasoned it, David now bore the responsibility of caring for her. She had his baby. So now that her husband's dead in battle, it's David, the father of her baby's responsibility to care for her and their baby that was soon to be born. She may have even thought that David loved her. We really don't know. But whatever the case, the natural negative consequences that came as a result of David's earthly decisions were many. And we can kind of put ourselves back in her mindset and see the anguish going on at that time. But what about the supernatural consequences that would come as a result of God's disapproval of David's actions? Keeping in mind, once again, that God was operating with the nation Israel according to the law of Moses. Well, the first thing that God did was to bring David to a realization of his displeasure at what David had done. He sent the prophet Nathan. Now, this is not a son of David. It's another Nathan. This is a prophet Nathan. He sent him to deliver that information to the king, which we see as we enter chapter 12. And the Lord sent Nathan unto David. And he came unto him. And Nathan said to David, there were two men in one city, the one rich and the other poor. The rich man had exceeding many flocks and herds. And you see what Nathan's doing here? He didn't go to David and say, look what you did. Oh, you guilty rascal, you. Instead, he circumvented David's pride nature so David would listen. And so he tells the story of someone else, not of David. And David's listening intently to this story, and we'll follow it through. Verse 3, "But the poor man had nothing save one little ewe lamb, which he had bought and nourished up. And it grew up together with him and with his children. It did eat of his own meat, and drank of his own cup, and lay in his bosom, and was unto him as a daughter." Verse 4, "And there came a traveler unto the rich man, and he spared to take of his own flock," he refused to take something of his own, "and of his own herd to dress for the wayfaring man that was coming to him. But he took the poor man's lamb, and he dressed it for the man that was come to him." So instead of taking from something he owned, he stole from somebody else. And Nathan's relaying this picture to David. Now David's anger began to build as he hears the story against the rich man. David hadn't realized that the parable was directed at him. The rich man represented David, who had many wives, while the poor man, representing Uriah, had only one wife, Bathsheba, who he loved dearly and cared for to the very best of his ability. Naturally, the Lord had Nathan circumvent David's pride nature by pointing in a different direction. Paul did the very thing. He and Apollos would, or Barnabas rather, he would point to himself rather than the people to get a point across to the people. But before David knew it, he was sympathizing with that poor man's dilemma. And he was ready to have that rich man put to death. Look at it here in verse 5. "And David's anger was greatly kindled against the man." He's mad. "And he said to Nathan, As the Lord liveth, the man that hath done this thing shall surely die." Ooh, what a decision to make. Not only was the rich man to be put to death, notice David's decree that the rich man should also have to pay for the wrong that he had done. Here it is in verse 6. "And he," that rich man, "shall restore the lamb fourfold." Before he dies, he's going to pay back because he did this thing and because he had no pity. David had been the one lacking pity all along. And now, according to David's very own words, straight from his mouth, this rich man should have to be the one that would have to repay for what he'd done, and not only repay, in a fourfold way. Little did David know, while his wrath was being vented, that the story was all about him. And much less did David know that the multiplied way in which had been his would be taken away when it came to that repayment in accordance with his own decree. He's going to have to pay fourfold before he dies. Now watch what Nathan does as he sees David's heightened wrath against the ruthless rich man who had stolen that which the poor man treasured. Here it is in verse 7. "And Nathan said to David, Thou art the man." Now watch as verse 8 continues. The Lord directs David's attention to the capacity resident in his own name, God's name, of the one who had been responsible for providing David all that was his in the first place. It was God that brought David to where David was. It hadn't been David's efforts. Notice how the I's stand out in this passage. "Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I anointed thee king over Israel. I was your supply. And I delivered thee out of the hand of Saul. I was your banner, your delivering, your conquering hero. And I gave thee thy master's house, your provider, your Jehovah Jireh, and thy master's wives into thy bosom. And I gave thee the house of Israel and of Judah. And if that had been too little, I would have moreover given unto thee such and such things." Interesting way it ends there, but in other words, I've been the one responsible for not only all that you have, David, but also for your lofty position as king over my nation. I'm the one that brought this about. And what's more, you haven't in the least bit exhausted my storehouse of blessings. There's much more where all that came from has been given to you already. All that you had to do, David, is what he's telling him here, was call upon my name. That's all you had to do. And trust me to exercise my name on your behalf graciously. And I could have given you so much more than that which has already become yours to enjoy. Of course, David had not called upon the name of the Lord. Instead, he'd been acting as if the Lord didn't exist at all. And he'd been solely and steadfastly bent on satisfying the lusts of his flesh. The fact is, the flesh cannot be fixed, cannot be repaired, cannot be satisfied. It will never be satisfied. The Lord had simply been allowing David to learn that painful lesson. Heartache is always the product the flesh produces when given free rein to satisfy its own lusts. Improper choices can only bring about painful consequences in whatever degree they may come. And David was soon to learn that lesson. he did go on to confess his failure under the law contract, as we see in verse 15, which is precisely what God wants Israel to do as a nation, by the way. We've sinned. Here it is in 2 Samuel 12:13. And David said unto Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Interesting that it's just now that he's realizing that. And Nathan said unto David, the Lord also hath put away thy sin, and thou shalt not die. Wow. What had the law of Moses called for when a person under the law contract was guilty of adultery? Some of you already know. Let's take a quick look. Here it is in Deuteronomy chapter 20 with verse 10. And the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. According to the law of Moses, David was to be put to death. Bathsheba would have been facing the death penalty herself if she had played an active role in that illicit relationship. If not, David would have also been guilty of rape, another transgression punishable by death under the law of Moses. So David deserved to die. Whatever the case, David was facing a death sentence according to the law contract. It was an act of God's grace to put David's sin away and to spare him from the death the law contract called for. However, David's own mouth called for a repayment to be made by the rich man in Nathan's parable, and how so? A fourfold repayment. Once again, look at David's words back in chapter 12, verse 6. And he, the man who stole his neighbor's ewe lamb, shall restore the lamb fourfold, because he did this thing and because he had no pity. So David brought about his own sentence from God as God put the law contract sentence away. By David's own decree, the rich man was to pay a price for his lack of pity. Little did King David know at the time that the price that he would have to pay for his own lack of pity would be a great fourfold price. Notice verses 9 and 10 as the Lord reveals that price to David. Wherefore hast thou despised the commandment of the Lord to do evil in his sight? Thou hast killed Uriah the Hittite with a sword. Now notice he's blaming David directly because David had brought it about. David didn't have to handle the sword. David was the one responsible, directly responsible for his death, for Uriah's death, and has taken his wife to be thy wife, and has slain him with the sword of the children of Ammon. So he's blaming David directly. Now therefore the sword shall never depart from thine house, David, because thou hast despised me and hast taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be thy wife. Verses 11 and 12 go on to say, Thus saith the Lord, Behold, I will raise up evil against thee out of thine own house, and I will take thy wives before thine eyes and give them unto thy neighbor, and he shall lie with thy wives in the sight of this sun. For thou didst secretly, David, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. S-U-N. Now keep in mind, the Lord wasn't the one who put it into the mind of the one who would take advantage of David's wives to do as he did. But the Lord in his foreknowledge knew the thoughts of the one who would end up carrying this out. And the Lord did nothing to prevent it. So that he was with David before, and now he's going to back off a little bit and let David reap some consequences. Those consequences coming from David's own mouth, he should have to repay in a fourfold way. In addition to this, look at verse 14. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the children also that is born unto thee shall surely, or the child that also that is born unto thee shall surely die. So God wasn't going to step in and prevent that either. He's going to allow that to happen. Now, this, if you think about it and transfer this over, the principle over to Paul's day about putting the man out of the assembly in Corinth that had his father's wife, whether stepmother or mother, who knows, but it was an incestual relationship taking place. And it wasn't the fact that this believer, soul shall be saved in the end, it wasn't the fact that this believer had done something and it was so dastardly that we can't have him around. It was blaspheming the Lord's name in that assembly in Paul's day. What a testimony to the assembly in Paul's day as this man doing this thing was doing it openly and saying, well, I have liberty and grace. I can do whatever I want to do, as I assume to be the case. And Paul says, put him out of the fellowship. Put him out from among you. And, of course, the purpose was always restoral, that he might be brought back in, that he might realize what he'd done. Talk about a fourfold repayment, though, when it came to King David. David was about to lose the son of his sin, we could call it. The son Bathsheba bore him by way of that illicit affair. The son died soon after being born. Some commentators say he probably died being born, but he died soon after being born. I don't think it's in the text that it happened at birth. But this wouldn't be the only price that David would have to pay. That fourfold repayment statement, remember, had come from David's own mouth. So there was more to come for King David. God declared in verse 10 that the sword would not depart from David's house. This tells us that strife and infighting, where his children would be concerned, would be something David would have to painfully endure, as great hardship in that regard was on its way to David's door. We see one of those painful situations appear as we enter chapter 13 with verse 1. And it came to pass after this that Absalom, the son of David, had a fair sister, whose name was Tamar. And Amnon, the son of David, loved his brother's wife, or sister rather, loved his brother's daughter. And Amnon was so vexed that he fell sick for his sister Tamar. Actually, sister, not daughter. For she was a virgin, and Amnon thought it hard for him to do anything to her. So he's fallen for his sister. I guess a lot of distress was coming to David's house, just as David's own mouth had decreed. David had been unable to control his own passions when it came to his desire for Bathsheba. So think about it. Now David would learn that one of his sons, the son named Amnon, was facing a similar situation, but in this case, Amnon's passion was aimed at Amnon's own sister. I've constructed a diagram to show you the interrelationships of David's children. This might help you better picture what was taking place and the strife and the infighting the Lord was talking about when he told David, the sword will never depart from thine house, David. I've listed David's 8 wives here. Keep in mind that he had at least 10 concubines and possibly more wives. I've also listed the sons born to David through those various wives. And as you can see on our King David's wives diagram, Amnon, David's son, through his third wife, Ahinoam, had begun lusting for his half-sister through David's fourth wife, Maacah, as you can see there on the illustration. Amnon wanted more than a brother-sister relationship with Tamar. Now, was this an infraction of the law contract? Would anybody know whether this was a direct transgression of the law? I mean, after all, she was his half-sister, was she not? Oh, same father, but different mother. So would this have been an incestuous relationship contrary to the law contract? Well, let's take a look. The answer is not so obvious. But it soon would be, as Amnon was plotting his attempt to fulfill that lust of his flesh. We'll take a look. That plot would involve Amnon feigning sickness, by the way, and then requesting of his father David to allow Tamar to be sent to his house, to his sickbed no less, in order to feed him. Dad, I need my sister here to care for me because I can't eat. So if she'll come to my house and prepare meat, then she can feed me. I'm that sick. He wasn't sick at all. What a lie. But that was his plot. Now listen to Amnon make his request of his dad, David, in chapter 13, verses 6 and 7. So Amnon laid down and made himself sick. Not a transgression of the law yet. It's about to become so. And when the king was come to him, that would be his dad, David, Amnon said unto the king, I pray thee, let Tamar my sister come, and make me a couple of cakes in my sight, that I may eat at her hand. Then David sent home to Tamar, saying, Go now to thy brother Amnon's house and dress him meat. So is David not responsible for sending his daughter to his son's house? Oh, it's coming back, isn't it, on David here? Can you imagine the heartache of King David when he discovered the result of his sending his daughter Tamar to the house of his own son Amnon? Amnon raped his sister. She objected, but that didn't stop her much stronger brother, as we see in verses 14 and 15. Howbeit, Amnon would not hearken unto her voice, but being stronger than she, forced her, and lay with her. Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred wherewith he hated her was greater than the love wherewith he had loved her. And Amnon said unto her, Arise, be gone. Now, is it not interesting how the flesh diverts the blame away from itself when its guilt-worthiness has played itself out through experience, and then begins to detest the one for whom the flesh has taken advantage, as though its own failure was the other person's fault? It's amazing That's nothing more than the pride of life, folks. It's the same. It's that woman whom thou gavest to me argument Adam employed in the garden, if you think back. When his own discretion had been discovered. Well, it's her fault. Now, the same thing is happening here. Now, he's his own, to divert and alleviate his own guilt-worthiness, Amnon is angry at Tamar, as though it was her fault. This is what the pride of life is all about. It's a fact of life for everyone with a sin nature. The Lord was allowing David to experience the same type of pain that he had brought upon Uriah through his transgression with Uriah's wife. What David had done was punishable by death, according to the law of Moses. Was what Amnon had done also against the law of Moses? Well, let's take a look at what the book of Leviticus has to say about such a situation. Here it is in Leviticus chapter 18, verses 9 and 10. The nakedness of thy sister, the daughter of thy father, or the daughter of thy mother, whether she be born at home or born abroad, even their nakedness thou shalt not uncover. The nakedness of thy father's wife's daughter, begotten of thy father, that was Amnon's relationship with Tamar, she is thy sister. Thou shalt not uncover her nakedness, a direct violation of the law contract. Amnon had clearly transgressed the law of Moses, just as his father had transgressed the law before him, as this artist's rendition portrays. But had the people of Israel not sworn to God they were capable of fulfilling that law of Moses not only perfectly, but also consistently? Why, sure they had. And no less than three times they made that promise to God. Give us this law. We'll fulfill it. David had transgressed it more than once. And now God is allowing right within David's house for his very own son to commit a similar transgression. The reason this is such an important story, sitting where God has placed it, here in this account of the final phase of King David's reign, is because bucket of wrath number 2 was sitting on Israel's doorstep while all these things were taking place. When we return to Leviticus chapter 18, where God was telling Israel that incest of the type Amnon had committed was a transgression of the law contract, and where we also see King David had transgressed the law through his adulterous activity with Bathsheba, we find that chapter 18 doesn't come to an end when it reveals God's prohibition to these practices. It doesn't stop there. Notice what Leviticus chapter 18 goes on to say, beginning with verse 24. Defile not ye yourselves in any of these things. And he's just given all those prohibitions. For in all these things, such as David and Amnon were now guilty, the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. Notice those words, which I cast out before you. So doing these things caused the nations that were already in that land to be cast out of the land. What's the fifth bucket of wrath going to call for when it comes to Israel? Being cast out of the land. Do you see a precursor sitting here? The land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself shall vomiteth out her inhabitants. Wow. The land is going to spew these people out. And what's David got to look forward to for his nation Israel through what he had done? It's a precursor sitting here. Do you see what David and Amnon were setting the nation up for as they represented the ruling household of Israel itself? It's beginning at the king's household. Bucket number 5 of wrath, sitting in Leviticus chapter 26, called for Israel to be vomited out of the land should that fifth bucket fall on the nation. God had warned Israel before they ever entered their promised land that such behavior as David and his son Amnon were guilty of would call for that casting out. Let's jump back to Leviticus chapter 18, where we see God's further prohibition against David and Amnon's transgressions. Ye shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, why they had sworn they could do so, and shall not commit any of these abominations, neither any of your own nation, nor any stranger that sojourneth among you. For all these abominations have the men of the land done, which were before you, and the land is defiled. David and Amnon were defiling the land. That's how important this land is to God, who's going to repossess it. And now David and Amnon, it begins at the top, were defiling the land. Here's the telling verse, verse 28. And the reason why the Israelites should be particularly careful not to be guilty of the practices of which King David and his son Amnon were now guilty, that the land spew you all out also, when ye defile it, as it spewed out the nations that were before you. So Leviticus in advance told them what the land would do if they were guilty of what they had sworn they could uphold. And here David is. It's obvious that the transgressions of David and Amnon were were precursors, in a sense, of the worthiness of the nation as a whole for the buckets of wrath they had been promised early on to begin to commence falling on their heads. Well, as we continue in 2 Samuel, we see that the sword did not depart from King David's house, just as the Lord had foretold. He's suffering in that fourfold manner. David's son Absalom, Tamar's brother by the same mother, Maacah, ended up plotting, along with David's other sons, to kill Amnon for what he had done. Now, Tamar's sister, Tamar, her brother's angry. Her natural brother, full brother, was angry at what his half-brother, Amnon, had done to his sister. He's got revenge in his mind. But do you see King David's dilemma here? How could King David, who God had forgiven for his transgression with Bathsheba, now hold his son Absalom accountable for his transgression of the law? See the spot that David, talk about suffering in a fourfold way, paying back. It's payback time here for David. So David did nothing, and he said nothing. That is, until he learned that Amnon was dead. Let's continue with the story, verse 36. And it came to pass, as soon as he had made an end of speaking, that, behold, the king's sons came, and lifted up their voice and wept. And the king, David also, and all his servants wept very sore. He's learned something here. But Absalom fled. Absalom had plotted Amnon's death, his brother's death. And he brought it about, had it brought about. And Absalom fled after that, after David found out about it, and went to Talmai, the son of Ammihud, the king of Geshur. And David mourned for his son, referring to Amnon, every day. Had Bathsheba not agonized over her husband's death? A death brought about by King David? Even though King David hadn't personally raised the sword, as would be said in the vernacular of our day, the chickens had come home to roost. Now David's seeing his own sin played out before his own eyes, and he's suffering the way Bathsheba would have mourned. David was now being subjected to the same type of heartfelt agony that he had inflicted upon Bathsheba by having her husband killed. David and his servants wept, and the verse says, very sore. Verse 36. They wept very sore for the son he had now lost. David longed for Amnon because David's son Absalom had his servants kill Amnon in revenge for what he had done to Absalom's sister. Why? David had been guilty of the same thing Amnon was now guilty. David was getting a taste of his own medicine, and the taste was most bitter, I'm sure, at that time. Obviously, Absalom realized that his father would eventually find out that he had been the one responsible for his brother Amnon's death. So he fled to Geshur. You can see it there on this little map. And he stayed out of David's sight for 3 years. Now, just like Amnon ended up despising the one he had been guilty of injuring, his sister Tamar, Absalom would in time turn against the one that he had been guilty of injuring, his father. This is how the pride nature works. His father David. He did return to Jerusalem after his 3-year absence in Geshur. But at the request of David himself, Absalom was not permitted to see his father for an additional 2 years. So now he's away from dad for 5 years. Doubtless David was harboring some anger and some resentment toward Absalom, as we can see here, because David was grieving for Amnon, who had been killed. According to what we read there in chapter 14, Absalom was an extremely handsome man, like his father before him. Verse 25 tells us, but in all Israel there was none to be so much praised as Absalom for his beauty. From the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was no blemish in him. Do you know anybody like that? It wouldn't be difficult for Absalom to win the hearts of the people, would it? Which Absalom would soon be set out to do. Whenever a person came to the city to see David, in order to have a judgment rendered by the king, who was to render that judgment, Absalom would meet that person at the gate. He hung out at the gate for this purpose. With the words we see in chapter 15, verse 4. See if you can see a plot in Absalom's mind here. Absalom said, moreover, to the person coming for judgment, oh, that I were made judge in the land, that every man which hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice. Oh, your father won't? And it was so that when any man came nigh to him to do him obeisance, he put forth his hand and took him and kissed him. What do politicians do today when they want to be voted into office? They kiss the babies, don't they? Feigned humility and a promise to resolve all their problems. Absalom was the true politician, out schmoozing the population that he was slowly winning over to his side. After 40 years, according to the biblical account, Absalom journeyed to Hebron with the intention of rebelling against his father and overthrowing his father's kingdom. Naturally, the support of the people of Hebron, who were more than likely insulted because David had moved his kingdom from Hebron on to Jerusalem. So we see the reaction of David and his men when they get word of Absalom's intentions in verses 14 and 15. And David said unto all his servants that were with him at Jerusalem, Arise and let us flee, for we shall not else escape from Absalom. Make speed to depart, lest he overtake us suddenly and bring evil upon us and smite the city with the edge of the sword. And the king's servant said unto the king, Behold, thy servants are ready to do whatsoever my lord the king shall appoint. David's getting out of town, because David knows that Absalom's out to take his kingdom, out to overthrow him, and David's ready to flee. David and his men took refuge beyond the Jordan River, we're told. This gave Absalom a clear path right straight into Jerusalem, where David would suffer another insult at the hand of his rebellious son. The sword would not leave his house. Talk about the one without pity needing to repay fourfold. David's getting a taste of it. He was paying dearly at this time. Now you may recall that it was from his vantage point on the rooftop. Where was David when his sin took place with Bathsheba? Was he not on his rooftop? That's where he eyed Bathsheba, with whom he committed adultery. Now watch what was about to happen, about to take place from that very location, David's rooftop, as Absalom entered Jerusalem. This account sits in chapter 16, verses 21 and 22, as we're working our way toward the end of 2 Samuel. And Ahithophel said unto Absalom, Go in unto thy father's concubines, which he hath left to keep the house, and all Israel shall hear that thou art abhorred of thy father. Then shall the hands of all that are with thee be strong. So they spread Absalom a tent where? Upon the top of the house. And Absalom went in unto his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Wow. In the very same place that lust was born in the mind of David, now his son has entered Jerusalem, and he's taking his father's concubines in the very same location. There's another important picture here of David typifying Christ that you may not have noticed unless you know something about the man named Ahithophel. For that, let's jump ahead to the book of 1 Chronicles for a moment, chapter 27. Here we find a listing of the leaders who assisted David and went in and out with him month by month throughout all the months of the year, the Bible tells us. Notice one of those men whose name appears in chapter 27 and the first part of 33. And Ahithophel was the king's counselor. Now, Ahithophel was the one telling Absalom, take your father's concubines. He was someone who David had trusted in very much. In fact, they had become very close friends, according to Psalms 41, written by David himself. Let's watch as David speaks of his former counselor, this man named Ahithophel, telling his son to take his father's concubines, beginning in verse 9. Yea, mine own familiar friend in whom I trusted. Psalms 41, beginning with verse 9. My own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me. But thou, O Lord, be merciful unto me, and raise me up, that I may requite them. By this I know that thou favorest me, because mine enemy doth not triumph over me. So David's saying, would you exercise your Jehovah Nissi name on my behalf here? Who's King David calling upon in this psalm? Why, he's calling upon the name of the Most High God. David was calling upon God to exercise his name on David's behalf. What did God want Israel to learn? He wanted them to learn that they could count on him to do that when they called upon his name. And, of course, he would put his name into operation on their behalf, and he'd do it graciously. So David trusted in the Most High God to do that very thing, which can be seen as David concluded Psalms 41 with verses 12 and 13. And as for me, thou upholdest me in mine integrity, and settest me before thy face forever. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel from everlasting into everlasting. Amen and amen. So be it, and so be it. David had more to say about Ahithophel in the 55th Psalm. So you can see how the Psalms go hand in hand with David's life. He wrote them. So when you get into the Psalms, you can see things happening in David's life and go back and see what David's attitude was while these things were taking place. Listen to David's words there as they appear in verses 12 through 14 of Psalm 55. For it was not an enemy that reproached me. It was Ahithophel, his very own counselor. Then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me. that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide and mine acquaintance, Ahithophel. We took sweet counsel together, and we walked unto the house of the God in company. Ahithophel had become a traitor. Do you not catch the picture of David typifying Jesus Christ here? What comes to your mind? Important stuff as we see here. Did Israel's rightful king, well, we know it was David. He was betrayed by a close associate, one who had befriended him and worked closely with the king on a regular basis. Would Jesus Christ, also Israel's rightful king, who came along later on in Israel's history, not also be betrayed by one who had gone in and out with him on a regular basis? The man named Judas Iscariot. You see the typification here? The picture should be obvious to us. Let's look back with me at 2 Samuel chapter 15, verse 31. And one told David, saying, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. And David said, O Lord, I pray thee, turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. He's calling upon the Lord's name. The Lord had known ahead of time what Judas Iscariot would betray him. Here in verse 31, we see that David had known ahead of time that Ahithophel would act as the traitor where he was concerned. Absalom, David's son, had been no less a traitor to his father, as he had been plotting his father's death with Ahithophel the entire time. David eventually encountered his son's forces in what had been called the battle. It's been called the Battle of Ephraim's Wood, because Absalom's forces and David's forces are going to meet up. It's called the Battle of Ephraim's Wood. How would David's men fare in this conflict? Didn't David just call upon the Lord's name? The answer lies in chapter 18 of verses 6 and 7. So the people went out into the field against Israel, and the battle was in the wood of Ephraim, where the people of Israel, fighting on behalf of Absalom, were slain before the servants of David. And there was there a great slaughter that day of 20,000 men. Was the Lord with David and his people? Absolutely. More of the forces fighting against David's men escaped into the woods than were killed in the conflict, according to the account. 20,000 were killed, and more than that fled into the woods. One of those who escaped was Absalom. Absalom himself, who made his exit upon a mule, the Bible tells us. Notice what happened to Absalom, though, as he was making his hasty retreat in chapter 18, verse 9. And Absalom met the servants of David, and Absalom rode upon a mule, and the mule went under the thick boughs of a great oak, and his head caught hold of the oak, and he was taken up between the heaven and the earth, and the mule that was under him went away. In other words, this one who had betrayed his father had hung himself. Not intentionally, of course, but there he was, hanging by the head of his hair, caught up in the thick boughs of an oak tree, as this artist's rendition portrays. That was not such an amazing thing to happen, given what we're told about Absalom's hair, back in 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26. Why am I staying on these things about hair? I don't know. Okay, 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 26. And when he, Absalom, polled, that means cut or shaved, his head, for it was at every year's end that he polled his hair, because the hair was heavy on him, therefore he polled it. He weighed the hair of his head after he polled it at 200 shekels after the king's weight. Now, does that give you any idea of anything? That's a lot of hair. 1 shekel weighed 11 grams. Does that help? Not really. So Absalom hair weighing 200 shekels would translate to nearly 5 pounds. Actually, 4.85 pounds to be more precise. Now, we don't know how long he let his hair grow each year, but the verse does tell us that he polled it every year. So it could have been this long, and he could have cut it up to here, or it could have been this long, and he cut it up to here. We don't know. But the word polled there comes from a primitive root meaning to be bald, figuratively to shave off. If Absalom shaved his head yearly, which the verse says he did, we don't have to know how long it was when he cut it. We know that whatever length it was, and to whatever length he grew it, his hair grew at a rate of 2.2 kilograms every year. That's in the verse. How does 2.2 kilograms of growth yearly translate to the average yearly hair growth of people today? 2.2 kilograms. Well, it's been estimated that on an average, a person produces about 0.076 kilograms of hair on a yearly basis. This tells us that Absalom would have produced 30 times more hair every year than is produced by the average person in our day. 30 times more hair. That's a whole lot of hair. That translates to about 3,000 times more hair than I produce on a 2-year basis. As you probably hadn't noticed. But then again, mine's not the average head of hair. Of course, Absalom wasn't an average person either. He was the best-looking man in the nation Israel. And as we read earlier, from the sole of his foot even to the crown of his head, there was absolutely no blemish in Absalom. So, yes, we can see how, with all that hair in his head, it would have been possible for Absalom to become entangled in the boughs of an oak tree. And as this artist's portrayal suggests, especially when God intervened when it came to the entrapment of David's betrayer. Keep in mind, David had called upon the name of the Lord, and certainly God intervened. Absalom wasn't dead. He'd just been stopped dead in his tracks. Certainly the Most High God, working on David's behalf, hadn't intended that Absalom get away with the betrayal of his father David. David had called upon him. David, the man God had chosen to be Israel's king, had called upon the name of the Most High God. Now, David hadn't taken part in that battle with Absalom, but he did direct his forces when it came to the battle strategy they were to employ in that conflict. And one of David's directives is sitting in 2 Samuel chapter 18, verse 5. Let's take a quick look. And the king commanded Joab. Remember, Joab was the commander of David's forces, his nephew. The king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, saying, deal gently for my sake with the young man, even with Absalom. This is my son. Deal gently with him. And all the people heard when the king gave all the captains charge concerning Absalom. They knew what they were not to do. They weren't to harm Absalom. So should Absalom be captured, they weren't to kill him. They were to deal gently with him, as David said. After all, whatever else Absalom had done, he was still King David's son. As the story has it, one of Joab's men discovered Absalom hanging in that tree by the hair of his head. And true to David's directive, he didn't kill him. But he did reveal his dilemma to Joab. Now, who was Joab? Well, we know Joab was one who always wanted to take matters into his own hands. Commander of Israel's forces. So Joab's response to the fact that this man had spared Absalom's life is sitting in chapter 18. Shouldn't Joab have said, you know, you're right. Your dad said deal gently with him, and so I'm glad you didn't kill him. Let's see what Joab said. And Joab said unto the man that told him, and behold, thou sawest him? Why didst thou not smite him there to the ground? Well, I would have given thee 10 shekels of silver and a girdle if you had killed this guy. In spite of David giving him clear direction, deal gently, and he was the leader of Israel's forces. So we can see the nation's downward track because it's starting at the top. Obviously, Joab wasn't overly concerned with David's desires. He'd always been, as I said, one to take matters into his own hands. And that's precisely what he intended to do in this instance. Notice how he and his men handled the situation of Absalom hanging in the tree in verses 14 and 15. Then said Joab, I may not tarry thus with thee, to the guy who told him that he left him alive. And he took 3 darts in his hand and thrust them through the heart of Absalom while he was yet alive in the midst of the oak. And 10 young men that bare Joab's armor compassed about Absalom and smote him and slew him, directly contrary to David's desire and his decree. Here again we see another artist's betrayal of Joab's discovery of David's betrayer, Absalom. David's betrayer had in essence hung himself. Thinking back, we're told in Matthew chapter 27 verse 5 that the one who betrayed Jesus Christ, Judas Iscariot, after that betrayal took place, went and hanged himself. Isn't that interesting? That's another interesting parallel. There's no record in 2 Samuel that David ever discovered how his son died in that conflict. He was simply told that Absalom was dead. So Joab's protecting himself. After which David was overwhelmed by grief. Is that not suffering in a fourfold manner? In accordance with what David's own mouth said should happen. Verse 33 in chapter 18 records his response, the king's. And the king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he went, thus he said, O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee, meaning died in your place instead of you dying. O Absalom, my son, my son. Do you see another parallel picture sitting there? If you don't, you should. David's son betrayed his father, and in that betrayal he became David's enemy. In fact, Joab would later accuse David of hating his friends and loving his enemies. Here we see David crying out that if it had been at all possible, he would have willingly died in the place of the one who had become his enemy. Well, Jesus Christ willingly died for the Israelites as they had become his enemies. In fact, the Israelites were the very ones crying, "Crucify him, crucify him." In spite of his love for his people, they wanted Christ, their rightful king, dead. But even though the picture's present, Christ went far beyond King David. Christ actually did die in the place of the people of God's nation, as we see in Matthew chapter 20, verse 28, "Even as the Son of Man came not to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give his life a ransom for all." This is prophecy. To give his life a ransom for many. Prophecy relating to Israel. Christ died for his enemies, according to prophecy. This is why the verse tells us that he gave his life a ransom for many. Of course, God would appoint a new apostle. We know that. The Apostle Paul. To tell us how Christ died for more than his enemy in Israel at that time. In accordance with the revelation of the mystery, he gave himself a ransom for all to be testified in due time. If it doesn't, you should remember this verse. Look at here, Romans 5, verse 10. "For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall also be saved by his life." Christ died in our place while we were enemies of God, according to the revelation of the secret to be revealed by the Apostle Paul, who, as we said earlier, 1 Timothy 2:6, gave himself a ransom for all to be testified in due time. So we've seen picture after picture after picture of the various ways in which King David typified the Lord Jesus Christ. They wouldn't have had a clue of any of this in King David's day, folks, but we can certainly look back and we can see how God had his Son's death in mind for all mankind all along. Israel went on to defeat their enemies during the remainder of that interlude of blessing. God ushered in and he gave it to his nation. He gave them a picture of what they could have if they would only abandon the notion that they had righteousness in themselves, and make their confession they couldn't live up to that contract for their righteousness, and simply call upon the Lord to exercise his name on their behalf and to do so graciously. This is the lesson God was teaching them. Apparently, King David learned that lesson because of his statement made at the close of chapter 22 in verse 15. "He is the tower of salvation for his king, and showeth mercy to his anointed, unto David, and to his seed forevermore." In spite of all that David had learned, do you suppose that David's flesh had been refined? Now he's going to change that flesh and make it Christianize his flesh? Well, was David now a better man from fleshly perspective? Or was David's flesh what David's flesh had always been, bent on satisfying its own lusts? You recall the illustration we used in an earlier study entitled Israel's Cycle of Sin, as we were going through the time of Israel's judges? Here it is again, just to refresh your minds. It's the same pattern God shown us from the outset of his plan to teach his people Israel the meaning of his name. He showed us Israel's failure and the result of that failure. After a time of suffering, the consequences of that failure, Israel made their appeal to the Lord, after which the Lord made provision for the deliverance of his nation. All things began looking up, and Israel realized how God had blessed them. A time of complacency began to set in as the people lost sight of how God had worked graciously on their behalf. That complacency was nothing more than the fleshly nature of man allowed free reign. And before any time at all, the nation was right back in a state of failure all over again. What's happening to David back here? You see why we've got these stories where they are? Same pattern we've seen in our study of David here in 2 Samuel. In spite of the failure of his flesh, David finding himself on the receiving end of what he himself had sown, God would exercise his name on David's behalf, and he would do so graciously over and over and over again. So God has been showing us throughout our studies the incapacity of fleshly man on the one hand, while holding up the capacity resident only in his name on the other hand. He's been proving to us through all of these studies of Israel's program and our journey through the Bible thus far, the incapacity of fleshly man to merit anything from God by way of human performance. We've seen it over and over. We saw it with Adam. We saw it with the Gentiles. Prior to the establishment of Israel, we saw it with Noah. We saw it with Moses. We saw it all over again with the patriarchs of the nation God promised he would make of Abraham. And here again, we're seeing it in 2 Samuel in the life of David, God's chosen king. What a lesson we're learning as we go through the life of David in our journey through the Bible. Stay with us, and we'll see that David's about to fail again another time. We'll pick that up where we left it off in our next lesson next week as we continue on in our journey through the Bible. Interesting studies as we see what God's showing us all along and how this is doctrine we can apply to today. No man's flesh will ever perform to the standard of God's righteousness, because the flesh will always revert to the only thing the flesh can do, and that's to try to fulfill the desires of the flesh.